Hello, everyone. Welcome to Behind Massive Screens, a game development podcast here from Massive Entertainment in Malmö, Sweden. And for the second time, and planned permanently.
So far,
welcome to my dear co-host, Dory.
Hey, everyone. It's a pleasure being back here. And I'm very much looking forward to, continuing my reign and eventually having this as my own solo podcast.
Uh-oh. I'm looking for shark objects under the desk.
I mean, you don't know. I've already muted your microphone. I've cropped your shot.
God damn it. Never leave the editing to other people. Anyway, we touched a little bit about in the last episode. You might have missed that. Me and Dory used to work in games journalism and games media, both in front and behind. In your case, the camera.
Mm.
And we would go to different events and do a whole bunch of interviews every time. But there was one gang of people that it was best and probably most hilarious interviews we ever did. And became this nice, almost yearly tradition.
Yeah, it was like this breath of fresh air in a long line of stuffy game interviews.
Long, just like pretentious game designers and whatever we would meet. Sorry to all those people. And those interviews always included this guy. Audio listeners can't see me waving towards him, but very welcome.
Oh, yeah, this guy. And then I also need to make a sound, right? This guy, which is me.
That's your cue. Start talking.
Okay.
Welcome, Lau.
Thank you. So that is like, I don't know if it's 10 years ago or 15. It's like a long time ago, right? We were young.
We were young,
all of us.
Yeah, I think the first one is from 2010. So that's 12 years ago.
That's 12 years ago.
Yeah, we're much older. You still look the same.
I do.
Happy and youthful.
Thanks.
And now, lead game designer here at Massive Entertainment.
Yes. I wasn't back then. Back then I was doing a bunch of different things, but I think primarily part of a thing we called Copenhagen Game Collective.
Yep.
Which is this, which was like kind of like a game art collective where we explored all sorts of weird games essentially, and like just wanted to do silly stuff with games. And I think the reason you guys found us and interviewed us in these kind of like weird settings was that we often wanted to kind of like explore party games and like physical games and games where you touched each other or did awkward stuff with each other. So that often happened at like, I don't know, at late night, at events and all sorts of situations at Nordic Game Conference and all these places.
Yeah.
And we just did a bunch of silly experiments and I think that was really fun.
Yep. I mean, the one thing about those interviews, and we'll get back to Copenhagen Game Collective and all those awkward situations that your games can create, they were always not just silly. There were always like treasures in them of knowledge and ideas and inspiration, which I'm sure we'll get to in today's episode as well. But it was more than just silliness, even if it did include you doing push-ups at one point.
Mm-hmm.
You took that very seriously. And this shocked me as I was looking through them the other week. A lot of cursing.
Yeah.
How we got away with that back then. I don't think we could repeat what was said.
Nordic game media. I mean, we
like,
just
rock and roll.
It was Dogma.
Nordic game media with Danish developers and an Australian.
Yes.
But anyway, let's go. Before one thing we usually ask our guests what it is they do on a daily basis, like what a lead game designer does. I think we'll get back to that later. But let's just put a little bit into context. You went from this indie scene, which again, we will talk about later on because it was a fascinating time and a lot of fascinating material came out of it. But how did you go from that to Massive Entertainment?
Good question. So I think I found myself, where do I start? I guess let's just do the quick story. No. But like the quick story is that like I founded a company, after doing all sorts of weird stuff, we founded a company. We did some less weird stuff, but still kind of like weird stuff.
That's a good explanation.
And then I think 3-4 years ago, I left the company, and I took a long, hard deep inside my soul and tried to figure out what am I good at, what can I even do, right? And no, I don't know, but like I think essentially at that point I didn't really knew what I wanted to do with my career, and I kind of like. And that, like, I also, like, for a long period, I worked in this kind of, like, you could say, independent games or, like, alternative games or, like, almost anti-mainstream games. But I, like, slowly grew more and more kind of, like, interested in the idea of actually working on, on bigger projects and on projects that touched more people. And I think all these kind of, like, borders of, like, doing, anti-mainstream and so on became almost more and more irrelevant. And I think at some point I just kind of like saw that Massive were looking for people, and it was pretty easy to make an application. I just kind of like filled in a form, and I was like, well, I'm not sure I really want to do this. It's like almost the opposite of what I've been doing before. It's like hundreds and hundreds of people sitting in a big factory churning out games, right? But I like made an application because I was curious, and I wanted to kind of like talk with them and see what this is. And they replied back, and it's like, yeah, hey, we wanna chat. I was like, oh no, what am I going into? So I had an interview. They seemed really cool. They seemed like they worked on something they really had a lot of passion for, and they worked on projects that were actually, I think, impactful and meaningful. Also, just almost more than entertainment, but not saying that entertainment is not important and meaningful, right? But I think they had a mission, and I think that was really interesting and touching. And I did a design test, and I talked with more of them, and I think I kind of like, slowly kind of like the idea of working for a bigger studio like that became more and more kind of like interesting. So I joined the team, and it turned out, that's the thing that's a really interesting thing. It turned out that what how we're making games and the type of people that are working here, for instance, aren't that different, or they are like almost exactly the same type of people that I was working with before, right? It's almost the same type of like way we're working. It's like it's not that different,
right.
And so that was like I think a big revelation for me, and I think it was also interesting that I could use a lot of the things I've been doing before in this now kind of like big machinery. And in the end, I think the end result of what we're doing will be touching many, many more people. And in that sense, it might be more revolutionary or like more changing the world than what I was maybe trying to do 10 years ago.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that kind of bleeds into one of the things that has always fascinated me in the game industry, is because I've always had this kind of feeling that indies are what pushes the game industry forward. Like ideas that are explored in indie games where, there are fewer voices, or you can have a more distinct vision, and you have a quicker turnover in getting those ideas into a workable project. That has always been like, okay, here's the blueprint, and then a couple of years later, you see the same idea addressed in a AAA game, but made bigger. And in a way, I feel like kind of your career trajectory kind of mirrors that evolution in a way, because, I mean, while in the Copenhagen Game Collective, for example, you were making games that were kind of almost sending like the middle finger to games in a way, because it's like, we don't need our computer games to be on the screen.
Yeah.
We have games, and then it happens to be, a computer component. And it just, I'm really fascinated in hearing more of your perspective about indie games versus AAA, and like how the revolutionary ideas can be brought into a more bigger produced product.
But I think it's also like, I think it's worth noting that the picture today has become much more diverse and much more muddy in that sense. Like I think when we did these interviews like 12 years ago and so on, and even like slightly before, like 15 years ago, that it was really relevant to talk about mainstream AAA and independent game developments, and those two things were like very different, right? And there was this kind of like independent games movement that happened as almost as a reaction to mainstream games, right? It was like a creative kind of like a rebellion against mainstream games, against publishers that were like driving everything for profit and working on the same conservative ideas again and again, right? So I think at that point in time there was really this kind of like splinter in the games industry of a group of people that really tried to do new stuff and innovate. But over the last 10 years, I think that picture has become much more diverse, right? Like I think suddenly independent games almost became mainstream in that sense, right? And not that we took over mainstream, but it's just become normal, right? Now everybody, like all gamers and so on, are playing these type of games. They're playing big blockbusters, and then they're playing a smaller game as well, right? There's like a whole bunch of publishers that are actually publishing independent games, which is like, the whole thing we didn't want to have 10 years ago was like, no, we don't want publishers. And I was like, yeah, well, there's like independent publishers that are like funding these kind of like small creative projects. And like even big things like, Ubisoft or EA and so on are also publishing and even self-developing these type of games. So and that's like, almost like you could say like the independent games movement almost kind of like, and I think this is like a positive story that we don't really talk about. Like they actually succeeded in that sense, right? They changed the game industry to something that I think is much better, right? That we have a diversity in the type of experiences we can play, the length of them, the amount of money we want to pay for them, and all these kind of things, right? And it has opened up the industry for a lot of different inputs and a lot of different voices. What was your question?
No, but also, I mean, around the same time that indies were really taking off, I mean, you were seeing it was much easier to publish your games on Steam, for example, and a lot of the game engines became free to download and try until you were starting to make profit, and you needed to pay back, and that of course also helped a huge influx of new voices within games that maybe wouldn't have been there before.
Definitely. So it's like, yes, there was some people. Like it's obviously on multiple fronts something happened here, right? There were some people who wanted to do something crazy. Then, as you're saying, technology became much more approachable for making games. There were like game engines that were suddenly something you could get and play with. And platforms as well, right? So it was, Steam became a big thing where it was like, became significantly easier. Back in the days, you couldn't just publish a game on Steam, right? You had to almost send the copy to Gabe and being like, no, this is not good enough. And right? Like that's not how it works today, right? And Steam was even an open platform, right? Then like Nintendo or like Microsoft and Sony were like impossible, or you had to be kind of like an improved developer and get the development kits and so on. It was a really hard process. But those things slowly opened up there, like, what is that now? Like 15 years ago or something like that, right?
Around the Wii U.
Exactly, right? So the eShop and the Wii U, but also Xbox Live Arcade, I think, was the thing, right? And then Sony's thing became also a big thing. I can't like all these kind of like eShops and so on. And I think that what they were actually looking at was the the smartphones and the whole big business kind of like economy or like ecosystem around smartphones and making super small apps and earning money from them, right? So suddenly this whole, the smartphone, these kind of like platforms opening and technology, all these things kind of like made it possible for smaller teams to make games, which is insane because it wasn't like that 20 years ago or 25 years ago. It was like that, I think, 40 years ago, right? That was only like, in I guess in the 80s, a game was made by more or less like 3 or 4 or 5 people, right? Or 70s maybe. But like during the 90s and like around kind of like 2000 and so on, the industry became this kind of like bigger and bigger entities that only made AAA games and so on. It becomes really hard for like making games wasn't something you could just pick up and do, right? And I think that has been like, as I said before, I think that is super positive. That now it has been like we've broken down these barriers in many different ways, right? I'm not saying I did it, and I think everybody now almost just takes that for granted, and I think that's I think that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And so, would you say that that revolution of indie games is? Well, you kind of touched on that. It's kind of bleeding into the AAA development because it's I guess easier to experiment a little bit and prototype and get your crazy ideas and voice into a AAA game.
Yeah, and I think and I don't know if it's just massive. I don't think it is. But like I was imagining that when I showed up here, like everybody would be playing like Call of Duty or something like that. And I think, Call of Duty is cool, and I totally respect the craftsmanship and what they're doing, right? But it's not like it's not what they're doing. Like everybody is around me are playing. There's like Johan, he's playing Slay the Spire, which is this kind of like deck building roguelike kind of game, and there's like Scott, my other programmer, is playing Noita, which is this kind of like wizard, weird, like indie game where you can like generate all these kind of like elements and spells and so on. And Linda next to me, the game designer, like I don't even know what she's playing, but it's like super weird stuff and so on, right? So it's like everybody around me are just like playing these games and being inspired by them, and we're looking over and we're discussing, progression system in Hades and how these cool skills and what do they call them, boons and so on, like play together and you can like mix and match these things and so on. So we're discussing this kind of stuff, Subnautica, whatever, like all this kind of stuff is references for us. Obviously, it's also references for us on like, how they're doing weapons in Call of Duty, because they're doing them pretty good. And if we're working with weapons, we want to look at those that are doing it pretty good, right? But it's so there's like this big mix of references we're looking at and are playing and enjoying, because we like these type of games as well, right?
Stepping back a little bit, back into your background, because we mentioned Copenhagen Game Collective before. I'd like to just hear a little bit more about how you ended up in games to begin with.
Yeah.
And why you ended up in organizations such as the Copenhagen Game Collective.
Yes.
And what it kind of was, what it embodied back then.
Cool. Yes. So how did I end up in games? It's hard to say. I think I've always made games. Since I think the first drawing I can remember I did was like a board game of we played as a little fly, and you had to kind of jump from water lily to water lily, and there were like frogs, and you had to kind of like roll a die and so on. So I've literally always made games. I haven't really played like. As a kid, I just made games and hosted games for other people. Like I was the one organizing like how we were supposed to like make the rules for like, now we're playing with these cars, and it's like, no, well, we have to do a competition, and they have to like crash into each other or whatever, right? So like I just like always did that, and I still do it. Like when I with my kids and with my nephews and so on, like I'm still like playing with them and hosting games and whatever, right? And I think so that has always been with me. Obviously, I've had other interests as well. So I think when I grew up, I was like, well, and it wasn't that I didn't know anybody in the games industry, but I think I've always when I kind of like saw a future for myself, I think it often kind of like involved somehow working with games. And so for instance, I picked after I went to high school or gymnasium or whatever you're calling it in Denmark where I'm from. After that I had to kind of like pick a education, and I took a bachelor in something that is called humanistic information science, which is this kind of like a mix between IT and humanistic studies, and like so you're learning a bit of programming and you're learning a bit of learning theory and all sorts of things, which is like, it doesn't have an outcome, but like I was seeing it as like, well, it doesn't prevent me from working in games essentially. So that was like, it was a way of like selecting things that, and like in for instance, in those courses, whenever we did something, so we had to learn about databases, and like when we did it, when we had to build databases, I built it essentially like an online roleplay game. So you had to kind of like these kind of like, do you know them? These kind of like turn-based games in a browser where you like click on things and stuff happens and so on. So like, I just builded games and I hacked all my courses to make games essentially. And then there was a bachelor. Then I took a master in games at the IT University of Copenhagen, and that is a university that they do a bunch of different IT things, but they have a dedicated game lines. So that was really cool. So now suddenly I was in part of a crew with a lot of people that were interested in games, and that's actually around there where we formed the Copenhagen Game Collective. We did these kind of like we did all sorts of like weird prototypes and physical party games and so on. We did a erotic written game. We used the Wiimotes, for instance, to play with, and you had to kind of like get into a zinc together and find a nice rhythm towards a climax and these kind of things. And we did a kind of like a physical party game where you almost had to kind of like, it was called Brutally Unfair Tactics, Totally Okay Now, and you had to kind of like wrestle each other like in real life in order to push a button. And so we worked on all these kind of like weird explorations, and I think we figured out. So we were maybe a group of, I don't know, 10 people, and we figured out, hey, let's make a banner, or let's call ourselves something, because then people can start talking about us. So that was
worked on us.
Yeah,
obviously.
Exactly. So we called ourselves Copenhagen Game Collective, and then we got invited to like festivals and conferences and so on, and we could like
interviews,
and it's like, it's those people from Copenhagen Game Collective. So we did that kind of like around while we studied and in the years after, and while we did that, we also slowly also, you could say, matured or had to kind of like realize, well, we also need to kind of like earn money or like build maybe a career beyond being invited to a conference. So these group of people slowly formed into a number of game studios. Mm-hmm. One of them was a studio I formed with a few of the other people from there, which we called Napnok Games. So we worked on games to begin with for Nintendo. We did a game called what is it called? Spin the Bottle Bumpy's Party, which is this kind of like, it was for the Wii U. And the cool thing about the Wii U, like I was super excited about the Wii U because it exactly is, as you talked about, like you could turn off the TV and we could play together. We could place the gamepad in front of us or between us, and then we could play a physical party game together where the gamepad was kind of like facilitating the game, right? So we did this kind of like spin the bottle game where we had to like do awkward things together as dares almost. So you like spun a bottle, you got a partner, and then you had to do something like, it wasn't like super awkward. It was just like,
slightly awkward.
Yeah, well, like
semi-awkward.
It's like it wouldn't be awkward for children. Like that's the thing, right? But it would like be massively awkward for like grown-ups. So it's like hug another person and jump together, or these kind of like stand behind back to back and then pass a Wiimote over your heads and then below your legs and then like but carefully because like it was a badger so you couldn't shake it because then it woke up and so on. So these kind of like weird challenges. And we did a few other things. We did a game called Affordable Space Adventures, in where you use the gamepad as this kind of like interface to a spaceship, and you could play it in couch co-op where you were like multiple. Like one person was the pilot, another person was the engineer that controlled all the systems in the spaceship, and so on. So again, this kind of like exploration of like what is happening out here in the living room. What can we do with of interesting stuff with the physical controllers? So we did that, and we slowly kind of like grew. We got after that we got in contact with Sony, who wanted us to do. They had an initiative they called PlayLink, in where you had to kind of like play games with your phones. So again, they wanted like some interesting, fun party games with new weird controllers, and that was kind of like our thing at that point in time. And we slowly grew, and we're actually like a pretty big studio at that point in time. that's kind of like that was kind of like the history. Now I went beyond Copenhagen Game Collective, but like that was the history of like my career. And then at that point I was like, oh no, we're running out of money. Sony they want to make new PlayStation 5 games instead of silly party games for PlayStation 4. So we were like slowly scaling down, and that was also kind of like the point where I left my old studio and were like trying to figure out what I should do with my life.
And that's where we came back to how you ended up at Massive Quest. I think we're starting to see a theme here when it comes to controllers, and I really want to talk about that. I just want to say, I just want to return to one game you were talking about real quick. Brutally Unfair Tactics, totally okay now.
Yes.
Or Button, as most of the world will know it.
Yes. As one course during my university years, and this is going to kind of tell you a lot about the quality of that education, but we did do a streaming project, and this was back in 2012, where streaming stuff was actually kind of tricky. Special different software, keys everywhere, Justin TV maybe, I can't remember, but we did a special stream as a kind of the final not paper but the final assignment of that particular course. We did a Button live stream.
Oh, okay.
And the wonderful thing with Button is that it doesn't enforce any rules.
No, yeah.
So it essentially what you have 4 people, you have 4 controllers, and then the game tells you to do something. And it could be interact with those controllers. Like the person who presses A the most in this time frame wins. You have to rush to the controllers and kind of hammer. Or maybe just act like an elephant. This is where the push-ups in one of the old interviews came from. Stuff like that. And what we were able to create with it, even if we had taken out the live stream part, was with Button, you're able to build something around it. Like we had a wheel we would spin for the person who lost. They had to do something like dress up like Scooby-Doo or put lemon juice in their eye or like stupid stuff like that. And the
Welcome to Jackass.
It's kind of, that was my 2 hours of Jackass moments. But what the game facilitated this stupid behavior without it being on screen. It was
kind of gave you license to behave.
License to be at school getting student loans for it.
And I think that was it. Like I think that was the magical thing about it, right? That you're going up to something that looks like a video game, right? And the game tells you something. It tells you to like, put down your controller. So everybody puts down their controller. Then the game tells you to like step 5 steps away from the TV, and then everybody does that. And then it does a countdown. It's like 3, 2, 1. But then it like pauses on 1 and it goes on forever or something like that. It like so we constantly kind of like just play with the players. Like one of the messages was like, okay, step away from the computer. Then the game tells you to close your eyes. Then everybody closed their eyes, and then you were standing there like, how am I supposed to know when I'm supposed to open my eyes again? And in the end, like so people are like starting to kind of like follow these instructions, but then slowly figuring out that this game is just playing with me, right? And you're getting into this almost playful relationship with the computer of like, okay, let's playfully break the rules together. You could imagine that I'm holding you back and or like I'm jump starting and starting before you guys or whatever, right? So you're slowly starting to kind of like playfully break rules together and playfully interact with each other in really weird ways, right? Because the game is inviting you to that. Yeah. But and still, I think the magical thing is that you're not. It works, right? You're not because like you're still. When we play, when we play. When we play whatever soccer in the park, and there's no computer enforcing those rules either. But we follow the rules because like the game is more fun if we like mostly follow the rules at least, right? So that kind of thing of like it's actually interesting that we don't need all these layers of systems telling us what to do and not, because like we all enjoy having fun. Like sure, you could play Button in a very kind of like non-fun way of just like I'll just not move back when the game tells me to, but that means that you will lose out on the fun, right?
Yep. Because the game doesn't keep track of any scores, or obviously impossible for some of the things that it wants you to do. But the game is just there as a facilitator, as you say. You build up this relationship, and it's kind of communication with the game.
Yeah, it takes the rule set and the monitoring of following rules out of the game and into the collective consciousness of the people that are actually playing. And it kind of gives you license to play differently. I mean, like there's a whole subset of a culture subset of people that play games, speedrunners. That are intentional, like, I don't care how the developer is telling me to play the game. I'm going to do it this way, and I'm going to do it faster.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, and I think that's fascinating. There's like a lot of other examples of like, people playing, Dark Souls in like ways that are not,
on a dance mat or with a toaster.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like, why are you doing that? Because it's fun, right? It's not. It doesn't have to be. You don't have to play the most optimal way to have fun. Like often, actually, the most optimal way of playing is like sometimes just drawing the fun in many games, right?
Yeah. But coming from button having controllers, these loose kind of rules. By the way, the name brutally unfair tactics, totally okay now, also in itself creates this weird situation where obviously the game is not only telling me what to do, but also I'm obviously allowed to use brutally unfair tactics.
Yeah,
so the
totally
amount of pushing and shoving when you're trying to reach those buttons, it's not pretty, but it's so much fun. Anyway, because you touched upon it before, the controllers, your relationship to controllers.
Yeah, I'm super fascinated by controllers actually, and I think it's I'm fascinated because, and I don't think people realize that, but like controllers really define what type of experiences you can make as a game developer, right? Or at least it makes some experiences way easier than other experiences, right? There's no it's not without reason that modern gamepads have triggers, because like triggers makes it really fun to shoot stuff. Like it's just natural and it's nice and it feels good to shoot things with a gamepad. It's actually much more natural than it is with like a mouse and keyboard. I feel, at least. Obviously, a big debate, right? But like it feels good, and that means that it's just a natural. It's a natural thing to fall back to and make, like, let's make stuff where you like, use a trigger and aim at things. Wow, I wonder what that would be, right? But so that's why, like, whenever over the last 15 years, whenever some kind of like platform came out with a new controller, whether like it was like Wii modes or the gamepad or the Move controllers or like VR, whatever. Like, I think all the time something like that comes out, I think it asks kind of like a new question of like what type of experiences can this thing do, right? Because all these suddenly opens up for like, oh, Kinect. Oh, I did so many things with Kinect, and it was like, and it was so interesting, right? But for a designer, I guess. I don't, do people even know what Kinect is today? I don't know. They do. I guess some people will.
We might be dating ourselves by saying kind of when Kinect came out, but yeah.
But I think it's just so exciting because it just gives you this kind of like, what type of experience can I do, right? And you have all these pictures, and especially for Kinect, you have all these pictures in mind of what you think it can do, and then apparently it can't do that, but it can do other things and so on, right? But it creates this kind of like I think that's what I'm really fascinated about controllers, is that it kind of like it gives me a toolbox for like creating certain experiences, and you can either try to fight that toolbox, and that's sometimes interesting, right? Or you can play along with it and say like, well, this controller facilitate this kind of experiences, and I think even in big kind of like mainstream games, although like often they are like you're still tied to like, so often like the more conservative controllers like a gamepad and so on, but still, even just with a gamepad, I think mapping kind of like actions and interactions to different buttons still means something, right? It means something whether you're like you're using the trigger to hug somebody, or if you're using a button, right? Like those two things can like give different experiences for me. So like how I'm using a controller and the comfort of it, but also the experience of touching things and manipulating these objects really, I think really does something on a very kind of like low level.
How working with people that have like creating these games, like the erotic game we talked about before, very briefly.
Dark room sex game.
Yes. Look it up.
Wonderful. Very straightforward
Another
name.
point for me.
Looking at that, or other games that you made, like John Sebastian Joust and stuff. What happens when you put these things into? Is one thing to have a you're fascinated by the controllers and what you can do, and you're a game designer and can have like philosophical discussions about controllers. But what happens the moment you put somebody that might not be used to these kinds of experiences when you put the controls in their hand? Let's say a Wiimote, for example.
Yeah. So,
or a Move controller.
Like, I think so. So I think it touches on another thing, and now it becomes also a bit geeky, right? Because I think
that's
like
okay. Now it gets geeky. What is it, like half an hour in?
No, but like
I'm glad. Finally.
So often we think about controllers as input devices, right? Like they are devices that you use to kind of like control a game with, right? You give inputs to the game, and I think in modern kind of like user experience paradigms and so on, like I think this kind of like layer has to be as invisible as possible, right? You shouldn't be aware of you having a controller in your hand, like ideally, right? You should just be immersed in the game, and you should just be in there, and like the game should like you should just intuitively and naturally play the game. Like that's often a design paradigm, but I think, and that's maybe true or maybe valid, but I think especially looking at weird and physical controllers, it's almost opposite. Like that controller is also a output device, right? That controller is just, you know, and when I'm saying that, it means that I'm like, part of the experience is that, you know, me dancing or me shaking this thing or me, you know, in back in the day with like the Wii, and you had like Mario Tennis, right? And you can just play it like this, but like if you really wanted to enjoy it, you really played this tennis game as like you slammed the tennis ball with a racket, right? And that means like, and that's because like part of the enjoyment of that game is just observing and observing myself and feeling motion and feeling that I'm moving, right? It's not just like it's these kind of like motion controllers and so on are actually terrible input devices, right? They're actually really bad at controlling games because they're imprecise and they're terrible to work with and so on, right? But they are like great as like experiences and output devices. Like it gives me something. It's like a almost like another, like, so we have the visuals, we have the audio, but then I also have the motion of myself in a room, right? And I think that's something you rarely experience, and you can also see it on modern controllers, right? Like, you know, the haptics or the audio from the controller, whatever it is, like the adaptive trigger on the PlayStation. All these things gives me like send signals back to me, and like. Is like actually making the controller being like, you know, loud and noisy and say like, hey, I'm here, right? You know, and I think that's so that's really exciting, and I think so to answer your question.
It's okay. I've forgotten what the question was.
No, it was something about like what happens when.
When you give it to
what I'm
another
saying
person,
is when you give it to especially kind of like kind of like hardcore gamers, they start expressing, right? They start doing weird stuff, right? And they start dancing, they start experimenting with like, what can I do and how can this thing, right? So it's almost this, you know, you give them a permission and allow them to express themselves with motion, right?
Right.
So I think that's often what happens in these kind of situations. Like it starts becoming like you start actually acting. Like that's also like, I think, you know, playing these kind of games are super weird to do alone, right? Because like you're just standing there and I'm like, why am I even doing this? Why am I not having a controller in my hand, right? But in a crowd, in a party setting, it becomes meaningful, right? Because like suddenly there's people looking at you and you're like, it's like, you know, suddenly you can actually express and it makes sense to act out and have fun together, right? So I think these kind of like controllers like often give you opportunities and invite you to like act and engage with like an audience or a crowd around you, right? Or other players, essentially.
Yeah, and just on the topic of a controller being an input device that you shouldn't be conscious of, I've never really thought about it that much until I got a controller for my PC that has PlayStation buttons. And there's a bunch of games that have only Xbox input, so it says press X, and I'm like looking down the control, oh yeah, that's actually the square.
Yeah.
And just that little break in continuity, if you will, is like, oh yeah, I've taken it for granted so many times where I pick up a controller and I'm just pressing buttons automatically to do actions.
Yeah. So it's wild, right? What these kind of like shifts can do to you, and like how suddenly you're like, oh, I'm sitting with a plastic thing in my hand, right? What is going on here, right? So I think it is totally valid, right? To try to make it as invisible as possible, and try to have players not kind of like having to spend kind of like mental energy on like what is going on here, right? Like just being immersed in the game, right? And it's like that's also why you're often doing, everybody's trying to do the same type of mapping of things, right? It would be totally weird if you had to like move your character with your right stick and like look around with your left or whatever, right? It would just be like, why are we even doing this? Like, why are you adding this kind of like weirdness to this experience, right?
Unless that was like a part of what you want the player to be feeling.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think you have a certain amount of like weirdness budget you can play around with, and like you can try, to allocate it on different things in your games. But like if you go too weird, it just becomes like, people can't even recognize this as a game or whatever, right? So I think there's like, there's definitely room for doing new things and be like, well, wouldn't it be cool to use the controller and, I don't know, right stick use the right leg and left stick use the left leg and you go like this or whatever, right? Maybe not for all experiences.
What do you think? You mentioned it real briefly before. You just touched on VR. You just said the words VR. And if you say the words VR and experimental controllers, I guess we just have to talk about VR real quick.
Yeah.
How would do you think that this, like with the controllers and the kind of experiences that VR on top of that would offer? Or maybe we're moving away a little bit about what you said with people around you.
No, well,
VR is more a solitary experience
to some extent, right? But I think I did a prototype called, what was it called? It was like
not the same theme as the one.
No, it was like a hacking game. So we did just for kind of like a play, a game jam. We did a hacking VR game where like you put on your VR headset, and then you could type in a URL of like a real website, and then we kind of like grab the graphics from that website and like put it into like a 3D world, so you can kind of like move. So it was like this kind of like 90s hacking fantasy. So you had to kind of like navigate a cool 3D maze with the elements of the website that we kind of like just scraped. And then the way you controlled the game was that you just slammed a keyboard and you just like typed and then you like pressed, I think you looked in a direction and then you like pressed space and then you like flew in that direction, right? And I think so that's part of, and I think that experience as well is, that's also expressive, right? That's also fun, and it's part of like acting out a fantasy of like, yeah, that's how you hack in the 90s, right? You're just slamming a keyboard really, really fast and like, navigating a maze and so on, right? So I think there's something still in even in VR games, that I think can be expressive and can be social, right? Even in the same locations. I think there are also like really awesome prototypes of like, one player being in VR, another player not being in VR, and having kind of like interplay between those players, right? So, but back to your question of like, so VR, I think, okay, and now maybe I'm getting a bit kind of like old and grumpy.
Mm-hmm. That's fine.
But I think so we have had like in my kind of like career, right? We started out with the Wii, and then with like PlayStation Move and Kinect and VR, and wasn't there another thing I can't remember? There's been like this continuous kind of like stream of trying to innovate, which is like awesome, and I'm jumping into all these things and I'm like, yes, this is gonna be the next thing, right? This is gonna give me new interesting experiences, but we're still sitting here with a gamepad in our hand, right? And not playing things on TV, and I think and there are many reasons for that, but I think part of it is that you like maybe you even have like when you think about the like when I think even everybody, like game designers and just normal people in the street, when they think about these technologies, they think they can do a lot of really cool stuff that they really can't do. So you have these kind of like massive hype for like this innovating new experiences, but then you're just hitting the reality of like, wait, this is not how it's like actually working, right? So in VR, for instance, right, you a lot of people imagine that stuff like first-person shooter or first-person games would be like awesome, right? Because like this, you put the screen on your head and you look around, and that's what you do in first-person shooter. You look around, but you also move, right? And that's the other thing. And you can't really, movement in virtual reality is really, really hard, and is like makes most people sick and so on, right? So even like. So that's like, you could say, almost first wave of these kind of games is like, yeah, let's make a first-person shooter in VR. And then you put the head on and you run around and you give you maybe a controller in your hand, but it feels really weird because like your body is not moving and you are. So most people will start puking or you'll get sick after like 10 minutes at least. It's also weird that either you have a controller or you have these kind of like physical things in your hand, but it's like not really connected, right? What happens if you get to a wall and you touch it and you just like put your hand through it? And so all these things is like the dream you had about like, yeah, let's make first person VR games or like first person shooter VR games. Like that's like what everybody thinks would be like cool, but it's like, it doesn't work. Or like it's not actually a great experience.
Yeah, I remember at E3 we tried Resident Evil Village prototype in VR, and for that prototype they had not removed the head bob.
Mm-hmm. No.
So you're walking and all of a sudden your vision is like bopping up and down, and it was like, I think there was a line of game journalists out the door and puking right outside. It's just like the day was almost ruined.
Yeah.
The release version was fine, but it's like these lessons that need to be learned when they are coming in the first wave of content. Puts off the first adopters. And then it's really hard to kind of claw it back and convince them again.
Yeah. And I think for instance, for virtual reality, I think some of the stuff that really works is that, for instance, almost like third-person platformers where you have a static camera that you can sit and look at the scene, and then you're like moving a character around here.
Yeah, like Mask. That was great.
But that's not the fantasy, right? The fantasy is that you are like looking out of your eyes and like you're the person there running, right?
And for that you need the Magnus gloves, you need the Omni track board.
And it's I think it's actually the same with like all those technologies, right? There's like a fantasy in your head when you look at this kind of stuff. And like, then making games for those kind of things is like, suddenly you have to figure out if the Venn diagram of like the fantasies and what is realistic to actually do, if it even overlaps, or if it doesn't, right? For the Kinect, it didn't. It was like, you had this imagination, this is what I can do, and this is what you can do, and there's like no overlap, right? So, and I think the same thing for VR, right? I think we're still searching. Like, they are like really good and fun experiences. But I think we're still figuring out like where's actually that overlap of like my fantasy and what what works well, right?
Yeah. I think this is one of those conversations. Did you have?
Yeah, I was just thinking. I wanted to kind of bring it, since we're getting to the hour here.
I mean the boring. Maybe we're running out of time.
No, but I want to try and bring it a little bit closer to like what you do here at Massive.
Yes.
Right.
No, and I there was something that you mentioned before about controllers and being mindful of which action you're putting on which buttons, and that kind of the dichotomy between where you've come from in the past, where it's like, oh, you want to give agency to the player to play how they want, but then having a designed experience that how you want them to feel when they're pressing buttons, and also how that comes into customization and accessibility. For example, like how much freedom do you want to give to people to remap and stuff like that, while retaining, your intended feelings and purpose of the controls.
Yeah, I think I think that's super interesting actually, and I think it's also one of the things where like when for instance, when joining a big studio like Ubisoft, right, and Massive, they just have their stuff together so much more than actually we did in making indie games, right? Like there's just expectations, right? Like we do, like these things should be like extremely approachable and extremely accessible. You should be able to like always have at least a mode of like flipping it to left-handed, a one-hand mode and so on, and also fully accessible controls and these kind of things, right? And I think that so I think that is super inspiring that the bar is just high to begin with. It does create interesting questions, like and because you could say like, so what is accessibility, right? Like is difficulty settings. Is that now we are opening up?
No, this is a can of worms. At 50 something minutes in. Oh dear.
No, but like
what have you done?
But like we're working on experiences that are like sometimes intentionally adding friction, right? Intentionally making it hard, right? Or like at least making it a challenge, right? And I think it's just a daily kind of not necessarily daily, but like it's a continuous kind of like discussion of like, well, how do we just make this experience skippable or do we want to make it like super easy, combat or whatever, right? Should it be up to the player to just set these things, or what is actually kind of like our what are our intentions, right? With these kind of things, and I think. You could say, I think my approach, first of all, obviously, I think players should be allowed to ruin in their own experiences if they want, right? They should be allowed to, as we talked about earlier, like take agency and control over their own experience, right? Somebody might, I don't know, do speed runs, or somebody might play this in weird ways, right? And they should for sure be enabled and even empowered to do that if they want to, right? But then, and I think my other point to accessibility is that things should also be intuitive and simple to pick up, right? We should still strive for making something pleasant, something that a non kind of like hardcore gamer should be able to pick up and play and actually enjoy, right? Maybe they bounce into things where stuff is getting hard, but that at least kind of like that's my approach here. And but I think everything should be intuitive, and they should be able to understand what is going on, right?
To be able to scale their own challenge.
Yeah.
So I think, but I think it's I don't think there are like easy answers to these kind of things. So it's in that sense it's a super interesting design question that we're really often really sitting with and discussing.
I think we're sadly running out of time, but Lau, it's been fantastic to get to sit down with you again. No push-ups this time.
No.
But let's keep this going. We'll see you in 1 year.
Yes.
And then we'll do this again.
Oh, for sure.
Sounds good.
And thank you everyone for listening. Thank you again, Lau. Fantastic.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.